Hello and welcome to the first episode of Goddesses and Algorithms, the podcast where we explore intersectionality in urban life, identity, and design. I'm Ethan.
Joy. The show is all about making space, literally and figuratively, for queer people and women in cities around the world. We're planning to kick off this journey by unpacking what intersectionality actually means and how it shows up in the places we live. So Ethan, before we dive into the built environment, let's talk about intersectionality. It's a term that's thrown around a lot but often misunderstood. So what does it mean to you?
At its core, intersectionality is a term coined by the legal scholar Crenshaw in 1989. It acknowledges that people don't experience oppression in a vacuum. Instead, we live at the intersections of multiple identities that shape how we experience the world. For example, a queer black woman might face different challenges and more complex challenges than a straight white woman due to the combined effects of racism, sexism, and homophobia.
Exactly, so it's like layers of power and disadvantage that overlap. And cities, believe it or not, are often structured in ways that can either reinforce or disrupt those power dynamics. Intersectionality helps us analyze how systems of oppression operate simultaneously, including things like race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and more.
And that's where urban planning comes in. It's not just about zoning laws or road widths. Urban planning, when done without intersectional awareness, can make cities more hostile to those already on the margins. Think about transit systems that don't account for caregivers, or public spaces where trans and gender non-conforming people feel unsafe.
Yeah, and I think it's crucial to remember that intersectionality didn't just appear in a vacuum either. Crenshaw built on a legacy of black feminist thought. People like Lorde, and Angela Davis, who were already naming the ways in which race, gender, and class intersect long before the term existed. Crenshaw just gave us the language to talk about it in a legal and structural way.
Yeah, right. One powerful example I recently read was from Angela Davis's work on the prison industrial complex. She talks about how women of color are disproportionately incarcerated, often for reasons that reflect systematic failures. Poverty, lack of access to mental health care, histories of abuse. The prison system isn't just racist or isn't just sexist, it's both simultaneously.
So that's intersectionality in action. And to bring it back to the city, when we talk about who has access to things like housing, healthcare, and safety, the same overlapping systems are in place. A white gay man might feel safer walking in a gentrified urban area than a black trans woman. The experience of queerness is being mediated by race, class, and gender identity.
And it's not just about oppression. It's also about resilience. It's about community. It's about joy. Intersectional frameworks also show us how communities build strength at the margins. For example, disability justice activists like Mia Mingus have taught us that access isn't just about ramps. It's about rethinking space altogether. Her concept of access intimacy asks us to consider the emotional and relational aspects of how we move through the world.
And that's so important because if we only use intersectionality as a tool to identify harm, then we miss its radical potential. It's also a tool for imagining and building a world where all of us can thrive. Patricia Hill Collins, in her work on Black feminist thought, describes intersectionality as both a description of the world and as a tool for social change.
And that's where this podcast comes in. It's exactly where we want to place ourselves. It's about imagining urban futures where no one is pushed to the periphery, where difference isn't a liability, but a design principle. Because when we plan cities from the margins, everyone benefits. Think about the curb cuts. Originally, it was designed for wheelchair users, but now it's used by parents with strollers, delivery workers, travelers with luggage. Inclusive design ripples outward.
It's what Adrienne Marie Brown calls practical justice. These small acts of care and inclusion at the personal level that scale up to systemic change. If we plan from a place of love, care, and justice, intersectionality becomes a compass and not just a critique.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. And it resonates personally too. As a queer person, my experience of safety and belonging shifts block to block. Sometimes I pass as straight and blend in. Other times I'm hyper visible. That affects how and where I move. When I choose to take public transport, and how I dress.
And you shouldn't have to map your safety or capacity language. Urban planning needs to engage with these lived realities. It needs to ask whose bodies are seen as legitimate in public and whose existence can.
I mean, intersectionality helps us interrogate those very questions deeply. It's not enough to say this space is for everyone, because everyone is not a neutral category. When cities claim to serve everyone without acknowledging difference, they often serve the most privileged by people.
And that's why things like language matters. So policies that sound neutral, like affordable housing or safe neighborhoods, often hide inequalities. Affordable food, safe food. We need data, but we also need things like stories, histories, and memories.
And that's such a great segue, because intersectionality also teaches us to value qualitative knowledge, lived experience. In urban planning, we often privilege quantitative data, census figures, traffic flows, land use ratios, but storytelling is data too.
And that reminds me of the work by urban geographer Kern in her book Feminist. She uses her own experience as a mother, a commute, and an academic to show how cities fail to accommodate caregiving and interdependence. She argues that care should be central to city design and not just an afterthought.
I mean, Kern's book is such a powerful example of intersectional urbanism. It's deeply personal, but also political. It shows how the built environment is a reflection of values, and those values can be reshaped.
So to wrap up this first segment, let's return to our opening question. What is intersectionality? It's a lens, a practice, a framework for justice. It reminds us that no one lives a single issue life, and that no space is ever neutral.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also an invitation to design, to plan, to dream from the margins, to build cities that don't erase difference, but hold it with care.
And on this podcast, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to listen to the people who live at the intersections and learn from their wisdom.
Because the future of cities depend on it. Okay, let's shift gears to feminism within urban planning. Feminist urbanism isn't just about adding pink to benches. It's about rethinking the foundations of how cities are designed.
Right. Feminist planning critiques the male-dominated lens of traditional urbanism, one that often designs for a 9-to-5 car-owning, able-bodied man. But what about caregivers or people who move through public space differently?
Yeah, I mean, I recently read about the gender audits of public space. It's about asking, are sidewalks wide enough for strollers? Are there enough streetlights for women walking at night?
Feminism in urban planning also emphasizes care. Cities aren't just economic machines, they're lived spaces. You need parks, childcare centers, communal kitchens. The domestic shouldn't be excluded from design.
Yeah, cities reflect our values. So if we value equality, safety, joy, then our urban planning needs to be feminist, intersectional, and people-centered.
Absolutely, and feminist urbanism is not new. It's rooted in decades of activism and scholarship. So think of Jane Jacobs, who challenged the top-down, car-centric city planning of the 20th century with a focus on things like walkability, human-scale development, and social interaction.
And Dolores Hayden's work as well, especially her critique on suburban design in the US. She argued that the physical separation of home and work reinforces gender roles. Her idea of non-sexist cities invites us to imagine a shared domestic infrastructure, laundromat, communal kitchens, even neighborhood-based childcare services.
What I love about Hayden's vision is that it moves beyond critique into proposition. She asks, what would cities look like if they were designed around cooperation instead of competition, interdependence instead of isolation?
And I mean, that's such a powerful reframe. And it's especially urgent in the context of climate change and social inequality. Feminist urbanism challenges the idea of the rugged, self-sufficient individual. It centers the fact that all of us rely on networks of care.
And that care is political. Who gets to give and who gets to receive care? And under what conditions? It's a planning question. Public transport schedules, school zoning, sanitation systems, all of these shape the care economy, often invisibly.
And those invisibilities are gendered. In many cities, women make up the majority of public transport users, especially for non-work related trips, like grocery shopping, school drop-offs, and elder care. Yet transit planning often focuses on peak hour commutes from suburbs to city centers, a model tailored to male breadwinners.
And that's a great example of how cities can be gender blind. It's not intentional exclusion, it's systemic oversight. But the impact is the same. Women's needs are deprioritized and their labor made more difficult.
And that's where gender-sensitive design steps in. Not just creating spaces for women, but designing cities that recognize diverse gendered experiences. Like Vienna's gender mainstreaming project in the 1990s. And it led to changes in housing, lighting, transit, and parks based on the input of women residents.
Yeah, in Vienna they found that women and men used parks differently. Women wanted well-lit parks and open sightlines, when men wanted things like sports fields. So the city redesigned parks to include both, and the result was something that was more inclusive and safer for everyone.
And that's just a reminder that feminist urbanism isn't about exclusion, it's about inclusion. When you plan for the most marginalized, you end up improving life for everyone. That's the beauty of universal design.
Another example is toilet access. It might sound basic, but the lack of public toilets affects women, transgender people, caregivers, and people with disabilities the most. It's a dignity issue, a health issue, and yes, a feminist planning issue.
So many feminist urbanists are also artists, activists, and architects. Groups like Make Space for Girls in the UK challenge the idea that public space is for skateboarding boys by designing inclusive play and hangout spaces for girls and non-binary youth.
And let's not forget the feminist queer interventions too. So projects like Queering the Map, which is a community-generated map of queer memories and moments. These show how geography can be a site of belonging and resistance. It asks us to rethink how we define space and whose stories are recorded.
That connects us so much with what we're doing here. Feminism in planning isn't just about safety and access. It's also about joy. It's about pleasure. It's about memory. What would a city designed for pleasure look like? Where would the dance floors go? The poetry walls? The silent nooks for rest?
And that's the power of imagination. So feminist urbanism invites us to think beyond what exists and to dream about what could be. It tells us that planning isn't neutral. It's a tool. And like any tool, it can be used to uphold the status quo or dismantle it.
I think that's why this work feels so personal. It makes us ask, what kind of world are we building? Whose stories are shaping the blueprint? As planners, we hold so much power and also responsibility.
Yeah, responsibility, but also opportunity. If we can center care, equity, and joy in our design processes, then we can radically transform the way cities are experienced. We can reclaim space, and not just physically, but emotionally and culturally as well.
I mean, as a queer planner, I've often felt that certain parts of the city aren't for me. But feminist planning says all of you belong here. Your body, your history, your rhythm. The city should rise to meet you, not erase you.
And that means shifting from extractive planning to relational planning, listening instead of imposing, co-creating instead of dictating. Feminist urbanism is a pedagogy as much as a methodology. It's about how we learn and unlearn.
So, we unlearn the myth of objectivity, the idea that planners can be neutral or apolitical, and we relearn how to be accountable to those most impacted by our decisions, to the land that we build on, to the histories we inherit.
And as we close out this segment, maybe we can offer a few guiding principles from feminist planning.
Sure. 1. Design with care at the center.
2. Prioritize marginalized voices, and not just as a checkbox, but as co-authors of the city.
3. Challenge neutrality. Embrace the political nature of space.
4. Value everyday life. Cooking, resting, caregiving, as these are not secondary to the city. They are the city.
And 5. Dream radically. Feminist urbanism is not just about critique. It's about creating alternatives rooted in justice, intimacy, and collective flourishing.
And that's what this podcast is all about.
We're building a map together, not of streets and buildings, but of hopes and possibilities. A map where everyone belongs.
So thanks for listening to our second segment. And remember, the city is not finished. We're still making it, and we can still make it feminist.
Amen to that.
Okay, now let's get into something that might seem mundane on the surface, but is actually deeply political. Toilets and transit.
Absolutely. When we talk about urban planning, people often think of skylines, zoning, or transport corridors. But something as basic as a toilet, who has access to it, who feels safe using it, and where it's located, can reveal the hidden hierarchies and exclusions baked into our cities.
Let's start with toilets. Public toilets are a battleground, especially for gender diverse people. For instance, the design and distribution of gendered bathrooms often assumes a binary that excludes non-binary, gender non-conforming, and trans individuals. If you don't feel safe or seen in either men or women's spaces, what do?
You avoid going out, or you plan your day meticulously around where you know you'll have access.
Yeah.
This is what Mia Mingus, a disability justice activist, refers to as access intimacy, not just whether a facility exists, but whether it can be used without fear or discomfort. If using a toilet becomes a site of anxiety or danger, then the city isn't fully accessible.
And that's especially true for trans people who face disproportionate levels of harassment and violence in public bathrooms. A 2015 US transgender survey reported that nearly 59% of respondents avoided public restrooms due to the fear of confrontation. And while that's US data, similar stories emerge worldwide.
And the irony is, urban planners often treat toilets as afterthoughts. They're tucked away in basements, locked, or only accessible if you're a paying customer. But sanitation is a public health right. Think about street vendors, homeless folks, taxi drivers. Where do they go? If your job or housing doesn't come with a toilet, then what?
Exactly. And then add menstruation into the equation. Public toilets often lack bins for sanitary products, running water, or privacy. It's another layer of exclusion. Menstruating people, mostly women, but also non-binary people, are often left to improvise. It's undignified and unjust.
We should also talk about the labor politics of public toilets. In many cities, they're maintained by underpaid workers, often older black women, migrants, or working class women. So while the space may be public, the labor that makes it functional is invisible and feminized. It's an example of what urban scholar Anyana Roy calls urban informality, the idea that informal labor props up formal systems.
There's also a clear racial geography to toilet access. In apartheid-era South Africa, caste laws controlled not only where black people could live or work, but also where they could relieve themselves. And fast forward to today, in many informal settlements, there are still pedestrians or shared toilets that are unsafe, unhygienic, and undignified.
The Makaza toilet scandal in Khayelitsha comes to mind, where open-air toilets were installed without enclosures. The city claimed people would build their own walls, but that ignores the politics of dignity. Would that ever happen in Sea Point or Sandton?
Yeah. No, and that's the point. Infrastructure reflects values. Toilets are never just toilets. They are statements about who belongs and who doesn't. Which brings us to transit, another everyday system that carries enormous weight.
Definitely. Transit systems like toilets were designed for a very particular user in mind, the so-called rational male worker. The ideal commuter goes from home to work and back at fixed hours, 5 days a week, but that's not how most people live, especially women and queer folks who move through the city.
It's what transport scholars call mobility of care. Many people, particularly women, make complex multi-stop journeys, dropping kids off at school, picking up groceries, helping at a clinic. But most transit systems, from fare structures to schedules, penalize the type of movement.
And that's not just inconvenient, it's unsafe. Picture waiting for a bus in the dark with your child after a long, long day. Or trying to get home with heavy bags from the market, only to find your route has no shelter, no sidewalks, no lighting.
Leslie Kern in Feminist City talks about how women's fear of violence often shapes their movement through cities. It's not just about what happens, it's about what might happen. So we take longer routes, we pay for Ubers we can't afford, and avoid going out altogether.
That anticipatory fear is part of what feminist urbanist Anna Falou calls the geography of fear. The city becomes a maze of calculations: where to walk, when to travel, how to dress. Transit spaces like buses, trains, stations are key sites of vulnerability.
There's a great case study from Vienna. In the early 2000s, the city started collecting gender disaggregated data on transit use. They discovered that women were taking more, shorter trips and often accompanied by children or elders. So they redesigned bus routes, added lighting, benches and crossings. It's a model of gender-sensitive planning in action.
Johannesburg could really take some notes. A lot of our taxi ranks, for example, aren't just transport hubs, but they're also marketplaces, job centers, and social spaces. But they're poorly lit, chaotic, and often unsafe for women and LGBTQ commuters.
And they're mostly policed through informal norms and masculine authority. There's a power dynamic there. Who gets to control the space? Who feels entitled to speak up? Planning has to confront these dynamics head on.
Transport justice is gender justice. A truly inclusive city offers more than mobility. It offers autonomy, the ability to move freely without fear and on your own terms.
Let's also just shout out some brilliant thinkers in this space. Aisha Hans and Nitya Rao have written extensively on gendered access to urban services in the Global South. Their work in Indian cities show how caste, class and gender intersect to determine who uses which transit modes and at what cost.
And don't forget Caroline Criado Perez's Invisible Woman. She exposes how data bias in urban design and transport planning creates cities that work better for men.
Which brings us to the importance of data justice. If we're not counting the right trips, needs, and users, we won't build the right infrastructure. That's why participatory mapping and community-based data collection are so vital.
And not just for show. True participation means sharing power.
So whether it's a toilet or a train, we have to ask, who designed this, who was it designed for, and who was left out?
These aren't neutral systems. They're material expressions of our collective values, or the lack thereof.
Well, toilets and transit remind us that justice lives in the details. It's in the placement of a ramp, the timing of a bus, the lighting in a room, small choices that make big impacts.
And as urbanists, we have a responsibility to dig deeper, to understand the social life of infrastructure, because it's not just about pipes and platforms. It's about dignity, safety, and belonging.
So the next time you hop on a bus or look for a public bathroom, you need to ask yourself, who's missing? Whose needs were invisible in this design? And what would it take to truly welcome them in?
We'll leave you with that question and invite you to carry it through every space you enter. Because justice starts where you are.
And it flows through every corridor, cubicle, and crossroads of the city.
Toilets and transit, two of the most radical frontiers of urban justice. Who knew?
We did. Thanks for tuning into this episode. In the next episode, we'll explore queer nightlife as a space of resistance and design.
Don't miss it. And until then, stay curious, stay critical, and stay kind. Goodbye.